Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 40, and again I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. When the evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where the body was laid. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Many, it seems, have been disappointed with Mark's ending throughout the long history of the Christian church. In fact, you'll notice verses we didn't read together, verses 9 through 20. Well, scholars today are convinced that all of those verses and various arrangements and whatnot were added to the ending of Mark because of the disquiet the early Christians had with the way he ended his gospel. But so I'm not going to preach on verses 9 through 20. Now, you won't find anything in those verses that's not biblical. It's all drawn from other stories of the Bible. You'll see references to the end of Luke and Jesus' discussion with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. You'll see stories from the book of Acts, like when Paul was bit by a serpent and he survived it. He didn't die from the venom, even though it was a poisonous snake. So everything that's in there is drawn from other places of the Bible. So there's nothing like unbiblical in those last verses, at least not that I can see. But I don't think, and nor do scholars believe, that they were original to the ending of Mark. But I am convinced that Mark's ending, far from being abrupt, far from being inappropriate, is an apt summary of the heart of Mark's telling of the gospel of Jesus and his understanding of what the good news is and what our responsibility is to it. Nothing in Mark has turned out as the followers of Jesus expected it to turn out. And that includes the concluding events of Mark's gospel. But it is this unspectacular ending that reminds us of our responsibility to the gospel of Jesus. And so we're going to consider 4 aspects of these closing verses of Mark in this unusual ending. The first is reversal, the second is resurrection, the third is restoration, and the fourth is responsibility. And we're going to begin with reversal. In the closing verses of the gospel according to Mark, we encounter reversal. Now, I'm not going to read these verses again, but what I want you to focus on is chapter 15, verse 40 through chapter 16, verse 2. I'm just going to read some segments. But is this surprising to you that in the whole Gospel of Mark, we've heard a lot about Jesus' disciples? He's listed all of his disciples by name. They've been present for all these miracles. But never once, until now, did we know that there were this other group of people following Jesus. They're named here for the very first time. These final events of the gospel according to Mark, they're not entrusted to the ones who have participated in Jesus' ministry throughout the gospel. The closing events of this gospel don't include them. In fact, in Mark, after Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times at his trial, we never hear from the disciples again. This is a pretty bleak moment. The Jewish people in Jesus' day believed that the prophet Elijah would come to herald the coming of the Messiah and the new kingdom of God, and they were waiting for that. And Jesus told us that that person was John the Baptist. But things didn't work out well for John. He was beheaded by a vow, a silly vow made at a party, and then a woman asks for his head, and then he's dead. It's terrible. The Elijah who was to come is dead. And now Jesus, the Messiah, at least that's the way he presented himself, the Son of God, he's died too. And Jesus' disciples, they're gone. They're in hiding. Nobody's there. Maybe all is lost. Maybe this is the end. But Mark reveals to us in these verses that Jesus' story and his teaching and his ministry had far more influence than just the 12 people we've been focusing on. It had a pervasive reach that perhaps we only now begin to understand. And I think that's important for Mark, because when it seems like we're alone, when it seems like the world has gone sideways, when it seems like all hope is lost, and we've been betrayed by the powerful and the godly and the holy ones who we had looked up to, and now they've let us down, we think, well, the whole bottom's fallen out of this religious thing, right? But there's Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of Joseph and James, and Salome, and Joseph of Arimathea. There are always faithful ones. It reminds me actually of the story of the prophet Elijah, which is significant because he's all over the Gospel of Mark. Elijah lived in a time in which evil or idolatry, the worship of false gods, was pervasive in Israel. Israel was being ruled, the northern kingdom of Israel at the time was being ruled by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And Jezebel came from a culture that worshipped Baal and Ashtoreth, and she wanted her culture to be the dominant culture in Israel. And so they had outlawed the worship of the God of Israel, and they were trying to convert everyone to worship Baal and Ashtoreth and all that. And Elijah is called by God to stand against them, and he has some victories. Some of you know the stories. On Mount Carmel, great miracles were done in which Elijah demonstrated the power of God. But even after all of that, Jezebel and Ahab are entrenched, and they're powerful, and they slaughter just about every good prophet. And as far as Elijah knows, he is the only one left. He feels completely alone. The world is turned upside down. The religion of Yahweh is dead. Everybody worships Baal. And so Elijah, panicky and a little depressive and maybe even moderately suicidal, if you read the story in 1 Kings 19, runs away. And he goes back to where all this whole Jesus, well, not Jesus thing, but Yahweh thing began, which is at Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb. And he goes there to pray and to seek God's face. If you have Bibles, I'll invite you to turn to 1 Kings. I'm just going to read a little section of something that God reveals to Elijah that I think Mark is trying to reveal to us here in these closing verses. 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah is at Mount Horeb, and he is praying to God. And God has asked him to stand, and he's seen the huge atmospheric disturbances and all that stuff. And then finally, after all that is over, the voice of God's come to him in a still small voice. And this is 1 Kings chapter 19, beginning in verse 13. When Elijah heard it, the still small voice, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Elijah learned several things that day when he thought he was all alone. And he was the only faithful one left in the world, as far as he knew. He learns that there are 3 others that God's going to call to be partners with him: Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. And he also learns that somehow God was at work underneath the surface where Elijah couldn't see it, and 7,000 people in Israel had still refused to worship Baal. They were still faithful. Elijah had never met a one of them. As far as he was concerned, he was the only one left, but there were 7,000 who were still faithful. This is similar to what Mark is doing for us. He's reminding us that when the disciples had fled Jesus, when John the Baptist is dead, when Jesus himself is dead and buried, there are still people who believe. Mark wants to remind us that the faithful and the game changers are not always obvious. Peter, James, and John, they're the flashy ones. They were out there. Everybody saw them with Jesus. The rest of the 9 other disciples, they're the flashy ones. But they're not the ones who get the testimony that Jesus is risen from the dead. They're not the ones. Actually, they are dependent. Their future with Jesus is dependent on the testimony of somebody else. In fact, reversal occurs at the end of Jesus' life. And the first, the ones who witnessed everything he did, his closest friends, his closest confidants, are the last to hear. And the last, the ones who sat on the outside of the room, who were on the outskirts of the story, who were listening from a distance, following Jesus without fanfare, without glory, without honor, they become the first to witness his resurrection. And we too, when we share the gospel, we have to trust its power to transform. We have to trust that it's God who brings the gospel, not you and I. And that it will be more powerful than we ever have eyes to see. The power of the gospel is not in our hands, nor is its results. We are only entrusted to share it. Reversal. Second thing I want to look at is resurrection. Maybe this is the most obvious. Look at verses 3 through 6 of chapter 16. But this is the angel speaking. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him." Not only did Jesus have many more followers than it at first appeared in the gospel according to Mark, but Jesus' death was not what it appeared. When hope was lost, when darkness had overcome, when the powers of evil and corruption in this world seemed to have had the last word, defeat has been transformed. They could kill Jesus, but they could not keep him dead. But interestingly enough in Mark, this is the only miracle in the gospel for which there were no witnesses. On every other significant occasion, Jesus invited Peter, James, and John to bear witness to his miracles. But not to this. When Jesus was raised from the dead, no one was there. Even these women came to the tomb too late to see it. I think for Mark, this gives us who do not live and walk with Jesus a place to start our journey with him. All of us, even the disciples, only get to peek behind the curtain of resurrection once. Resurrection remains a mystery. We've witnessed Jesus' miracles, but the work of God in raising him from the dead remains cloaked in darkness. How did it happen? What did it look like? We can only testify that Jesus has been raised. We cannot explain it. There were no witnesses to see it. And what's remarkable to me is that each of us will witness the resurrection from the dead personally. This is the only miracle in the gospel that there were no witnesses for, and the only miracle in the gospel that each of us are guaranteed to witness personally. Because one day at the end of our lives, we will witness it not as an observer, but as a participant. In many ways, the gospel itself has been a story to prepare Jesus for that moment in which he finds himself in a tomb. And for us who follow Jesus, life itself is a preparation for that moment. No one witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, but we will all witness the resurrection at the end. Reversal, resurrection. Let's look at the third one, restoration. Verse 7. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Just in that simple statement of this, if he's an angel, if he's just a person, we just have no idea. All it says is a young man in the gospel. I think Luke tells us they're angels, but we're just in Mark right now. The disciples are not lost. and neither is Peter. They have fallen. They abandoned him. They betrayed him. But they are not bad soil. The last 3 or more years, including their failure on the final night and day of Jesus' pre-resurrected life, have been a tilling of the soil. This has been the preparation. Now they're ready. And Jesus will meet them in Galilee, the place where they first met him all those years ago. That he sends them back to the beginning. Go back to Sinai. Go back to where I met you, and I'll meet you there again. It's time for a new beginning in Galilee, but now they're ready to hear what Jesus has to say. And they're ready to see what he wants them to see. Finally, they can become his disciples. None of us are born ready to follow Jesus. None of us. And few, if any of us, are ready to follow him when we first commit to doing that, even if we were adults when we did it. We must be refined. We must be tilled. We must be molded. We must be broken and remade into beings made in God's image. We must mature. And when we are ready, Jesus comes again and asks us to follow him. The failure of the disciples in Jesus' restoration of them and calling them again to follow him in Galilee as he had first called them to follow him. What it does remind us is that we have to be patient with each other and with ourselves. Knowing that those who fail in ignorance or because of lack of maturity will be restored and remade in his time. So for Mark, not only is the gospel more effective than it may appear, there are people following Jesus we didn't know anything about. Not only is the final miracle of Jesus an event to prepare for throughout our lives for which no one ever bore witness, but also we should expect mistakes and missteps, to be hurt and to hurt others as we follow Jesus. Now, if we do that intentionally, that's a different ballpark, but many of us will do it. And that's what happened to the disciples. That is part of what it means to be made into good soil. The gospel's not magic. We're not transformed overnight. And if we ever said something like that, then we deceived our people. The gospel is not magic. But if we persevere, if we refuse to turn back as Jesus did, and as his disciples will, our transformation is not just possible, it's inevitable. We will be holy if we follow him. So, reversal, resurrection, restoration, and finally, responsibility. Look at verse 8. So they went out and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's terrifying to share the gospel of Jesus. It is terrifying to share the gospel of Jesus. According to Mark, even these first discoverers of the empty tomb did not at first intend to share the story. Who would believe them? They hadn't even seen Jesus. They just heard this guy tell them that. How could they share the tale? What if this guy was wrong? Now, of course, we know they did share their testimony. The very fact that there were Christians reading Mark's gospel were proof enough of that. And of course, the other gospels give us a little bit more of what happened next and we get a fuller story. But why did Mark end his gospel that way? Why did he want the last word we read in the first gospel of Jesus ever written to be that people were too afraid to tell people what they knew? I think he meant to remind us that the fear and uncertainty that you and I feel when we contemplate sharing the story of Jesus' resurrection with our friends or our family or our neighbors or our co-workers is no different than what the first witnesses to the empty tomb felt the day they were entrusted with it. It's terrifying to share a testimony you cannot prove, and one that we feel ill-equipped to share. But these women have reminded me, and I hope they'll remind you, that you don't have to be specially qualified. You don't have to be specially confident. You don't have to be specially charismatic. You don't have to be specially courageous to share the good news of Jesus. It is simply entrusted to us. And its power is the power of God, not the power of you or me. And we have to trust the one who entrusts it to us. If these women were too afraid to tell the disciples that Jesus was risen from the dead, they would not have known to go to Galilee to wait for him. And then what would have happened? But somehow these ill-equipped, marginalized, apparently widowed women, because it's likely that's why they're following Jesus, at least according to the history, end up being the ones who start the whole ball rolling on the story of Jesus' resurrection. Reversal, resurrection, restoration, and responsibility. This journey to follow Jesus is a journey in the dark. And that can be terrifying, and it can be confusing, and it can be upending. But his life and his teachings, and the teachings of the prophets and apostles, they provide us a light, and they put our feet on a path. And they ask us to trust them, not for a mile ahead, but for just as far as our vision can go. And we'll often face on that journey loneliness and mystery and fear. Sometimes we'll feel alone in that forest. Sometimes we'll feel lost in that forest. Sometimes we'll question whether or not these lights are sufficient. And in those times we look to Jesus and we remember where this road ends. It ends in an empty tomb. And that's the hope that we have to have the courage to share with others we find in the dark. This is evangelism. We don't decide our road. We don't decide our forest. But we're given a light to light our way and a road that Jesus walked first so that we would know the way through it. And we get to decide how we walk it, with whom we share it. Will you be witnesses for Jesus?